Welcome. My name is Harry Bleetler. I'm the chairman of the Program in Media, Culture, and the Arts, and welcome to the King's College. If you're a guest with us tonight, the King's College is a Christian liberal arts college here in Manhattan, and what we're about in a nutshell is leadership training in many ways for the strategic institutions that are out there, and many of those that we focus on these days in our curriculum are business, the political, economic, even philosophical realms, and media, culture, and the arts. And we take this very seriously, and that's why we're here in New York City. So if you're here for the first time, we really do welcome you, and thank you for visiting with us, and hope that you will have an opportunity to spend more time with us and get to know us. We are a unique institution, and very blessed to be here in New York City. I'm very excited tonight about our lecture, because we have with us tonight Dr. Dan Siedell, who is now visiting with us, but as a permanent sort of presidential scholar, art historian in residence. This is the first one of these kinds of appointments that we have, and we're very excited, in large part because Dan really is at the intersection of modern art and theology and sort of the Christian perspective on all of this today, certainly in the United States. And we're very, very fortunate to have him here, especially here in New York City, that is so central to the emergence of modern art, and still is in terms of what happens in contemporary art around the world. Dr. Siedell received his doctorate in art history from the University of Iowa. He also spent some time close to New York, where he got his master's degree in art history, theory, and criticism from Stony Brook. So he had an opportunity to come into the city pretty regularly. He also spent a number of years as professor of modern and contemporary art history, theory, and criticism at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And while there, he was also the chief curator at the Sheldon Museum of Art at the university, and had an opportunity to sort of both be a scholar on one hand, as well as be involved in sort of the curatorial process of the museum world. One of his more recent, better-known publications is God in the Gallery, which I think some of our students here at the college have read as part of the classes, and if you haven't read it, you will. This was published by Baker Books a few years ago. He's also scholar in residence at the New City Arts Initiative in Charlottesville, Virginia. He's also curator of Liberate, which is the teaching ministry of Tullian Trevedian at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale. But again, what I'm most excited about is that he is here in his capacity as the TKC Presidential Scholar and Art Historian in residence. And I want to read you just a brief snippet of something he said about why he's here and the importance of what he's doing. He says, "I want to help King's students experience the art world from the perspective of someone who has devoted his life to it. The appointment provides me the opportunity to pursue my work on modern and contemporary art in conversation with theology, as well as to deepen the church's understanding of the history of art as an important cultural practice with significant theological implications." There are very few places in the United States, and certainly at the college level, at the Christian college level, that are looking at these issues. And so this is another reason why we're just so very, very excited about having Dr. Siedell here. He is working on a new book, and you can probably figure out the title from the title of our talk tonight, Who's Afraid of Modern Art, which will be coming out this next fall. And he really is one of the more important voices in art history, the nexus of art history and contemporary Christian circles today. And so we are delighted to have him here. So please give him a warm TKC welcome, Dr. Dan Siedell.
Is it on? All right. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. It is a privilege to stand before you tonight as presidential scholar and art historian in residence at the King's College. I would like to thank President Greg Thornberry for his generous invitation to me to join this very special community. And I am deeply grateful to Harry Bleetler, Chair of the Division of Media, Culture, and the Arts, for his friendship and support for my work over the years. To the students, faculty, and staff here at King's, I look forward to serving you. The title of my talk tonight is, Who's Afraid of Modern Art? And let's face it, modern art is strange and off-putting. It doesn't behave quite like we think art should, such as impress us with the artist's technical ability to represent a world with which we are already familiar, or help us decorate our interior and exterior environments. And so a painting that includes distorted, tortured, and emaciated figures, garish colors, or perhaps worse, nothing recognizable at all, seems to serve no purpose in the world except to cause confusion and put us on edge. We do not understand how some small pastel and oil drawing entitled The Scream, painted in 1895 by Edvard Munch, sold for $120 million at Sotheby's in 2011. Or, just last week at Christie's, Francis Bacon's triptych of Lucian Freud sold for over $140 million. What are we missing? How can anyone pay that kind of money for pigments smeared along a piece of paper or a scrap of canvas? In fact, if we're honest with ourselves, we are hard-pressed to account for why anyone would pay even a few $100s for a painting. And yet there is something else that haunts us. Perhaps it's not just a sham, a joke, or a hobby for continental philosophers and critical theorists. Perhaps modern art is dangerous. Perhaps it actually teaches us to see the world in ways that produce vice. Perhaps it is a practice that causes us to lose our faith. Perhaps modern art is something to fear. My remarks tonight will not ease this fear. Tonight I will come clean about my 25-year relationship with modern art. I will testify to what modern art has done to me as a human being and as a Christian. In a pivotal scene in Walk the Line, the 2005 movie starring Joaquin Phoenix as Johnny Cash, record producer Sam Phillips interrupts Cash's rather bland rendition of a popular gospel song to tell him that he doesn't need his kind of music. Cash is offended, naturally, and asks why. Phillips responds, "Because I don't believe you." Cash thinks that Phillips is accusing him of not believing in God, but Phillips's accusation runs deeper. When Cash complains, "You didn't let us bring it home," Phillips loses patience. "You want to bring it home? Let's bring it home." If you was hit by a truck and you were lying in the gutter dying and you had time to sing one song before you turned to dirt, one song that lets others and God know about how you felt about your time on this earth, one song that would sum you up, you tell me you would sing that song about how you're filled with joy and that you're going to shout it? Or would you sing something different, something real? Tonight I will follow Sam Phillips' advice. I will sing something different, something real about my experience with modern art, something that reflects what I think about my time on this earth, something that will give you a sense of who this person is who stands before you tonight. Tonight I will make a confession. I've given my life to modern art and to the contemporary artists that have painted in its wake. But I have also felt pressure to justify my passion for modern art as a Christian, to step away from my work as an art history professor, museum curator, and art critic, to defend my relationship to it theologically and spiritually, even to respond to the accusation that modern art and I have been, as St. Paul warns, unequally yoked. I was born and reared on the plains in Nebraska and grew up in a large non-denominational church, both of which make my interest in the arts, and modern art in particular, especially perplexing. My father describes himself as a neo-evangelical after Carl Henry and his approach to culture shaped by Francis Schaeffer, with an imagination formed by a particular evangelical reading of C.S. Lewis's novels and apologetics. My father was addicted to classical music, Italian operas, and history, But our home wasn't a bastion of high culture. I never went to art museums as a child, nor was our house filled with paintings and sculptures. We had very little money and very little refinement, so the arts were not a part of our lifestyle or social accoutrement. Nebraskans and evangelicals are skeptical of art. It's not useful enough to justify its existence. It smells of the elitist or the bohemian, of the drawing room or the coffee house. Given the fact that my passion for modern art seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, it suggested to my friends and fellow congregants in my church leadership that I was not someone to be trusted. One encounter can be taken as paradigmatic. I had recently been appointed chief curator of the Sheldon Museum of Art. My hometown University Art Museum with one of the more respected collections of 19th and 20th century American art in the country. And in the Sunday Arts section, an article had appeared announcing my appointment. At church later that morning, during our meet and greet, an elder sitting in front of me turned around, shook my hand, congratulated me on my appointment, and then looking at me in the eye, declared, "Now you can take down all the nudes on display in the museum." This was not exactly the kind of greeting I was expecting, but it was an accurate indicator of the belief that art is more trouble than it's worth. It's something that has to be cleaned up and taken out, controlled, kept at arm's length, certainly not something to be embraced. All of this to say, there is nothing in my nature or nurture, nothing socially or culturally that can explain my passion for modern art. It is something, in retrospect, that I can only say happened to me. In fact, my love of modern art didn't even start with a painting. It started with prose. As an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska, I happened upon the reviews and essays of a critic working in New York, Donald B. Cuspit, whose writing about the most difficult and enigmatic artists, like Andy Warhol, Jackson Pollock, and Marcel Duchamp, made me feel that I needed to know them and discover the secret of their work. Let me reiterate, it was not an extraordinary encounter with a masterpiece at the Met or the Louvre that ignited my passion for art. It was the critic's sentences, his words. And in his reviews and essays, there was not a single reproduction of any of the work he addressed. Simply through Cuspit's seriousness, passion, and imagination, and the references and connections that the work of art seemed to extract from him, from Goethe and D.W. Winnicott to Rilke, Marx, Freud, and Sartre, I could sense that Cuspit had to bring his intellectual and emotional A-game to the encounter, and the result was electrifying. Perhaps what fascinated me the most was that a scrap of canvas with oil paint smeared around it could ignite such intellectual passion. It was, I admit, both intoxicating and perplexing. His words were poetry. They sung. And so I felt them before I could understand them. Those sentences that referred to paintings I couldn't even see imputed to them life-giving dignity, while deepening the mystery of the world. I began to feel the importance of human beings who devoted their lives to smearing oil paints on scraps of canvas, and human beings that lived to write about them, or exhibit and collect them. Although I could not articulate what that importance was. Cuspit's words did something else as well. They revealed the mystery of myself to myself. That is, I began to sense that taking art seriously, looking at it, thinking about it, and writing about it, was not so much about interpreting the work of art as it was receiving it, listening to its effect on me. And I then began to experience that strange feeling of detachment, of thinking myself thinking, and feeling myself feeling. That would be an important part of my relationship with modern art, and an important part of my growth as a human being. To experience a work of art was to allow it first to interpret me. And so after graduation, I left Nebraska for New York City to study with that critic at Stony Brook University, to discover art's importance and find the reasons for my unusual connection to it. For 2 years, I ate, slept, and drank modern art. I looked at classical Greek statuary, Renaissance paintings, and Velázquez portraits at the Met, medieval manuscripts at the Morgan Library, and the Vermeers at the Frick. But it was modern art, the hard stuff, at MoMA, the Whitney, and the Guggenheim, and the galleries in Soho, which seduced me. The damage had been done. Although I left the city for the Midwest to get married and do my doctoral work, which not surprisingly focused on the artists and art critics of the New York art world in the 1940s and 1950s, and although I ultimately returned to Nebraska to begin my career as a curator and art historian, I have never recovered from what modern art did to me those 2 years here in New York City. I grew up in a conservative, evangelical Christian home, and I honestly cannot remember a time when I didn't consider myself a Christian. I did not go through a period of rejecting my parents, the church, or my faith, and it never dawned on me that my work with modern art needed to be reconciled with my faith, or that I needed a Christian worldview in order to negotiate the minefield of modern art or the art world. I loved Jesus, and I loved thinking about Jackson Pollock's strip paintings. My love of modern art seemed as natural as my faith in Christ. That, of course, didn't mean that there weren't tensions, but I never considered that I needed a systematic theological framework to justify my interest in modern art. However, as I began to pursue theological and historical questions related to my church tradition, my lack of a systematic theological framework for my emerging vocation began to bother me. I wished I'd had a Christian worldview screwed on tight, which could have equipped me to think about how I could connect my faith and work. Every Christian thinker or scholar I encountered, either in person or in print, was concerned in some way with integration. And perhaps most striking to me, they seemed so confident about it. I craved that confidence. And so the burden to justify my work theologically was inevitable. It began when I was completing my doctoral dissertation on the critical reception of abstract expressionism. I found Francis Schaeffer's little book, Art in the Bible, in my father's library. And then I read H.R. Rookmacher's book, Modern Art and the Death of a Culture. And they confused me. The portrait of modern art that Rookmacher and Schaeffer painted, which depicted a face distorted by spiritual poverty and aesthetic decadence, didn't resemble the one I had fallen in love with, which possessed such surprising beauty hewn through suffering, resonating so deeply with my experience of the Christian faith. However, when I vowed to correct that distorted and emaciated portrait, what I was really doing was responding to my own fears of devoting myself not only to the study of modern art as a specialist, as my profession, but my fear of allowing it to become an inextricable part of my inner life. Were Schaeffer and Rookmacher right? What was I missing? What was wrong with me, spiritually and theologically, to be drawn to a cultural practice so universally dismissed by Christian thinkers? Will modern art destroy my faith? Since reading Schaeffer and Rookmacher, Christian writing on modern art has been a constant source of frustration and disappointment to me. It is not that the artists, philosophers, or theologians who write about it are wrong, although from my vantage point as a specialist, most have very little understanding of the history of art, especially modern art. Rather, the source of my frustration and disappointment is emotional and aesthetic. I simply do not feel described by their sentences. Their approach to modern art feels distant, at arm's length, and with their minds already made up as to why it should be avoided or explained away. My relationship with modern art was completely different. It had agency. It led, and I followed. And viewed through the probing binoculars of Schaeffer and Rookmacher and that concerned elder from my church, it was also illicit. I was on the slippery slope. Modern art had put its hands on me. It was doing something to me. It wasn't something out there that atheists, nihilists, or secularists were making or interpreting. It was in my house. We were doing something, wrestling, embracing, or making love. All I knew is that I wasn't staring at it from a distance, with the objectivity to pronounce once and for all on its vices, or have all its questions answered simply by applying a worldview to it. But how could I have admitted this to the church, to myself? that modern art and I had already consummated our relationship. In retrospect, I am thankful that I had the space to pursue my vocation as an art historian, wonderfully unencumbered by those questions during my formative years as a graduate student. I used to consider the particular brand of prairie anti-intellectualism and dispensational Christian community in which I was raised to be a curse, something I was glad to be rid of after discovering Calvin and Abraham Kuyper, as well as the deeper wells of Catholic and Orthodox traditions. But tonight, I can say that this disconnect between my faith and my work was a providential gift. It allowed me to plunge into my craft and learn it for its own sake, rather than merely as a means to score evangelistic points or decorate theological confessions. Yesterday, over at the website at First Things, Rusty Reno, an old friend from our days in Nebraska, had this to say about the Christian intellectual. He writes, "As much as possible, we need to enter into the actual conditions of intellectual work today. This does not mean accumulating academic credentials to gain entry into the higher reaches of elite culture so as to evangelize. An intellectual is not an intellectual unless he sees his work as an end in itself." And I agree with Reno. An art critic is not an art critic unless she considers the art and her response to it to be an end in itself. Now, this is not to deny the important work of integration, but it works best as a conversation. A deep love for and knowledge of the craft of art history and art criticism invites deep theological reflection at its very foundation. This is what I will explore with the faculty and students here at King's and share with the larger Christian community. The Reformation tradition argues that God doesn't need our good works, but our neighbor does. And so I felt, as I still do, that the work I do as an art historian, curator, and art critic, as well as teacher, is simply a manifestation of loving my neighbor. In my particular case, my neighbor is an artist who worked in New York in 1950, or Paris in 1900, or is working now in Los Angeles, like my close friend and fellow Nebraskan, Robin O'Neill. And the works they produced are also my neighbors, whom I love and serve, not by interpreting or judging them, but by first listening to them. My life as a Christian, as one who hears God's promise, "I am the Lord your God," and responds in faith, has been inseparably woven into my relationship with modern art. My lack of interest in most Christian approaches to the arts in general, and modern art in particular, is that from my vantage point, they simply don't have any skin in the game. I don't feel that they need the arts, that their faith in Christ is somehow, some way, desperately in need of this poem, that play or song, or this painting. Their sentences don't have the urgency and possess the weight of having struggled, fought, and loved art from the inside as a partner, neighbor, lover. I felt responsible to those artists I studied, dead and alive, and for their paintings, which have so much to say, and to the writers, curators, and collectors who preserved them and gave them life. And so, with apologies to Josh Ritter, I had a girl in the war, and if they couldn't help me find a way to help her, they could go to hell. In Rilke's poem, The Archaic Greek Torso of Apollo, the narrator is confronted by a marble statue. And here is Rilke's poem. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, the stone would seem defaced. beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur. Would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. The work of art, in this case a marble torso, makes a claim on the viewer. You, whom I see, you who stand before me, you must give an account. And I have felt that claim. Theologian Oswald Bayer simply but provocatively states, we must be told who we are. A painting does something like that to me. It diagnoses me, tells me who I am and who I am not. And one of the ways it does so is to disclose the present moment. As sons and daughters of Cain, we live our lives as restless wanderers and enveloped in a fog of discontent. We find comfort in the past with our nostalgia or regret, and in the future with our fears and ambitions. We reign as kings in what David Foster Wallace once called our tiny skull-sized kingdoms. A work of art jerks us out of that fog and back into the present moment, where I stand being looked at by another, spoken to by another, reminded by what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians. What do you have that you did not first receive? The painting, when I happen upon it at a museum, exists at that moment for me. I am the intended audience for that work, and it speaks to me. What do I hear? That is the challenge and opportunity of art criticism and theology, and that is where I live and breathe and have my being. In his book, The Wound of Knowledge, Rowan Williams writes, to be absorbed in the sheer otherness of any created order or beauty is to open the door to God, because it involves that basic displacement of the dominating ego without which there can be no spiritual growth. For me, a painting is that kind of open door. Every conversation I have with an artist, Christian or not, is a theological conversation. But there isn't much writing on art in general, and modern art in particular, from a Christian perspective, that reflects on the claim that it makes on the viewer. What usually matters is the artist's worldview, his or her beliefs, or the work of art's capacity to illumine historical context, or a million other things that distract us from this isolating encounter. Yet I agree with both T.S. Eliot and Oscar Wilde. Eliot once said that the meaning of a poem lies somewhere between the poem and the reader. And Wilde observes, for when the work is finished, it has, as it were, an independent life of its own, and may deliver a message far other than that which was put in its lips to say. I know artists who profess atheism with their lips, yet make paintings that confess otherwise. And it is also my experience that self-described Christian artists make paintings that say something else entirely. Burdened with the desire to justify my relationship with modern art to the church, feeling that I owed it to Schaeffer, Ruckmacher, Wolterstorff, Seerfeld, and others, I wrote a book entitled God in the Gallery, A Christian Embrace of Modern Art, which was published by Baker Academic Press in 2008. It was written while I was the chief curator of the Sheldon Museum of Art and teaching graduate-level seminars on modern art at the University of Nebraska. I argued that the tensions between the Reformed and evangelical tradition and modern art was not modern art's problem, but with the kind of Christianity that was brought to bear on it. In response, I offered a Christian tradition that was shaped by a larger Nicene tradition, especially through the tradition of the icon, as well as liturgical and sacramental practices, as a way to give modern art and my passion for it theological and spiritual space for it to breathe and then to speak. But in retrospect, it didn't matter what theological tradition I was accessing. In the end, I was trying to justify modern art to myself. If I could do so, perhaps I could claim it as a legitimate relationship. I could once for all make an honest spouse of modern art, to reconcile my faith and my vocation, reconcile myself to myself. But I stand before you tonight unable to justify my relationship with modern art, theologically or otherwise. All I can do is confess that after 25 years, I cannot imagine my life as a human or as a Christian without it. It has made a claim on me, and God has graciously worked through that claim for his purposes inside and outside the church. The tradition of modern art, beginning with Gustave Courbet in the 19th century and extending into the present, establishes the artist's studio as a legitimate and fertile place for a human being to paint their way into their identity, through their faith, disbelief, hopes, and fears. In the studio, an artist stands before herself, the world, and God. Unhinged from the necessity of understanding her work as the fulfillment of commissions, she is free, or as Sartre observes, condemned, to define her own trajectory for her own work, and through her own felt experience to create her own significance, to invent her own roles as artists and the function of her artifacts as a means to give meaning to her life. Free to do anything in the artist's studio, the modern artist has a responsibility, however, to do something. The modern tradition in art is the accumulation of these remarkable somethings, thus disclosing the human condition in particularly powerful and distinctive ways, as art becomes a means not only for self-discovery, but also as a means for how that self relates to the world and to God, even if God is merely an echo or the fear of judgment. Rather than illustrating or making theology visible for his audience, the modern artist is involved in a theological practice in paint. He or she may not recognize it as such, but as Oswald Bayer reminds us, knowledge of God and knowledge of self are not to be separated. The result of this self-discovery in the studio is pain. The pain of alienation, loneliness, and death. Edvard Munch, whose picture The Scream sold for $120 million, once said, "Art emerges from joy and pain." And then he added, "but mostly from pain." And this seems to me one of the most important lessons of modern art. It reminds us of something we desperately want to forget: our suffering, our vulnerability, and our weakness. At the deepest levels, it is the emaciated figures of Munch, rather than the heroism of Michelangelo's Titans or the youthful beauty of Raphael's angels, that connect with us. If we let it, Munch's wound connects to our wound. Modern art puts us back in touch with our pain and suffering, our fear and alienation, and our utter dependence. For we are all like Melville's Ahab, gnawed within and scorched without. Yet it is only there, in our vulnerability, misery, and anger, that God meets us. In East of Eden, it is only through this suffering and fear that we can experience beauty, goodness, and truth. Francis Bacon once said about his vocation, "I painted to be loved." Do you hear the pain and honesty in that sentence? And this from one of the most wealthy and powerful artists of the 20th century? The tradition of modern art reminds us that all human creative work, even and especially here on Wall Street, comes from the desire to be loved for who we are and the pain of not receiving it. The tradition of modern art refuses to ignore the pain. In My Bright Abyss, Christian Wyman observes, "If God is a salve applied to unbearable psychic wounds, or a dream figure conjured out of memory and mortal terror, or an escape from a life that has become either too appalling or too banal to bear, then I have to admit, it is not working for me." And then he states, "I never truly felt the pain of unbelief until I began to believe." It seems to me that faith in the promises of God's word actually increases the disparity between the promise we hear, and that promise is, I am with you always, even to the end of the age, and the world that we see, the sickness, the death, the injustice. The gospel actually opens up a space for lamentation, for anger, for dismay, for crying out, why? That is the question I often hear in modern art. Ironically, it reminds me that a painting is more than meets the eye, and that we live by faith, not by sight. And appearances, even painted appearances, can deceive. And so I have learned to lean into my passion for modern art without the protection of a Christian worldview. And free of the burden of justifying it theologically, I have discovered paths rich for theological reflection, just as modern art has offered me a way to think more deeply about theology. But Christ doesn't make everything fit together so that we can sing that same song that made Sam Phillips cringe. My experience, and I'm willing to bet it is yours as well, is that you're lying in a gutter somewhere dying. And the Christ that you confess there is a Christ you can only respond to in faith. Modern art has often forced me to take leaps of faith, leaps from which I continue to fall. Yet leaps I would take again and again, and leaps, no doubt, I will take again and again. One of the questions I fear, and I have feared it with ever more intensity over the last few years, is what do you do? And as my life circumstances have changed, I've deflected it in different ways. I've said, well, I'm an art museum curator, or I'm an art history professor, or I run a studio for an artist in Miami. And more recently, I've said I'm the director of theological and cultural practices at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. But my vocation, what I've been called to suffer, is to love modern art. God made me to look at and think about paintings. And no matter from what institutional location I receive a paycheck or the title on my business card, my relationship to modern art remains the same. Not long ago, faced with what I can only describe as a vocational crisis, I escaped to where I felt at home as a person made by God to look at paintings, here to New York City. And I went to look at some paintings by Paul Cézanne at the Museum of Modern Art. At the time, it's all I could think of doing. But these paintings of Cézanne and I have a history. We first met when I was a graduate student. I initially considered his clunky landscapes, sloping still lifes, and thick bathers to be nothing but bridges to abstraction, an awkward but necessary transition from Monet to the defiant black squares of Malevich or the tragic gestures of Pollock. If they were important to me, they were only so historically, as I was figuring out the tradition of modern art. But others, like Monet, Rodin, Rilke, and Heidegger, whom I was devouring at the time, thought otherwise. If only one could think as directly, Heidegger said, as Cézanne paints. In 1899, Henri Matisse purchased a strange little painting of Cézanne's at great financial sacrifice. In an interview in 1925, Matisse confessed, "If you only knew the moral strength, the encouragement that his remarkable example gave me all my life. In moments of doubt, when I was searching for myself, frightened sometimes by my discoveries, I thought, if Cézanne is right, I am right." And I knew that Cézanne had made no mistake. Matisse continued, "It has sustained me morally in the critical moments of my venture as an artist. I have drawn from it my faith and perseverance." At the time, I remember asking myself, what was I missing? According to the poet Rilke, this was not an unusual question. For a long time, nothing, Rilke writes about Cézanne's canvases, and suddenly one has the right eyes. The right eyes did not come to me in graduate school. They came as I began to work closely with artists over the next few years, to sit with them in their studios, watch them work, and reflect on our conversations. It happened as I wrote about paintings, organized exhibitions, and instructed students. And perhaps most importantly, it happened as I experienced the struggle to remain faithful to my vocation, to what took me to New York City to study modern art in the first place. It happened in the midst of professional challenges and personal responsibilities involving much more than painting. The right eyes came as I suffered as a human being and experienced failure as a husband, father, son, friend, and art historian. They came as I witnessed similar suffering and failure in the lives of the artists about whom I cared so deeply. The right eyes came when I looked at Cézanne's paintings and saw them as artifacts made by a human being who suffered his vocation, suffering his artistic project, struggling with doubt his entire life. In fact, the right eyes came just a few months ago. After 21 years of marriage, 3 teenage children, a radical move from Nebraska to South Florida to work for an artist who was my best friend of 12 years, that ended in failure and disaster. My wife and children, I must add, have been implicated in my relationship with modern art, their own lives touched by it, not only by enduring long periods of my emotional infidelity, but also having their worlds forever changed by decisions I've made for its sake. So, what was Cézanne's artistic project? His single artistic goal, which is also the driving aspiration for the tradition of modern art, was to paint nature as he experienced it, as he received it, sur le motif, as he would say. That is, out in the landscape where he would set up his easel. The results were surprising, to say the least, and he experienced significant opposition from the academic establishment. Amidst the insecurities and doubt, the resistance and misunderstanding, he painted until the day he died, after having contracted an illness while being caught in a thunderstorm while he was painting sur le motif. He made 954 paintings, 645 watercolors, and 1,400 drawings over the span of his lifetime. He rose at 4 a.m. and was either in his studio or sur le motif by 7 a.m. every day. Cézanne was a servant to the world around him, looking and studying and ultimately reveling in the wonder and mystery of what was given to him. He would sit for hours staring into the landscape with no movement, lizard-like, as observers called it. They said that it could take 20 minutes to an hour between brushstrokes. While his establishment colleagues in the academy painted mythical figures, gods and goddesses, cherubs and angels, elevating the imagination of the viewer toward God through beauty, Cézanne dwelt in his and our creatureliness, feet firmly planted on the ground. Many of his admirers claim that his greatest gift was to paint the weight of his subjects, whether it was a head, house, or oak tree. One hostile critic said that Cézanne could even paint bad breath. Cézanne's art, indeed the tradition of modern art within which he painted, reminds us we live our lives sur le motif. We are always in it. That is, in the terrible beauty, suffering, and frightening givenness of the world, as our stomach churns and our mind races. Heidegger said that Cézanne's paintings declare one thing: life is terrifying. And yet, Cézanne's paintings also say something else. Although the world is full of pain, suffering, and doubt, if we allow ourselves to sit still, perhaps lizard-like, and look closely enough, we can hear something else, something real, a song. In an essay on the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, Joseph Brodsky wrote, "Love is essentially an attitude maintained by the infinite toward the finite. The reversal constitutes either faith or poetry." I'm not exactly sure what I was doing at MoMA looking at those odd paintings by Cézanne a few months ago, But I think I was, like Matisse, looking for faith and perseverance. And standing before you tonight, here at the King's College in New York City, as I embark on a new stage in my life, I think I can say that I found it. So, who's afraid of modern art? I am. And I'm learning each day to praise God for it. Thank you very much.
We're going to take a few minutes to take questions. So take a minute to think about that. Let me start with one, if that's all right. Let's say over the recent past years, would you, as you've worked through this journey with modern art, would you say that more of a space has opened up in the Christian world to discuss these things, to really think about them deeply with nuance? Or do you still feel like you're sort of banging your head against a wall in terms of trying to work through some of these issues?
Yeah, I think there's space that's opened up. And I think that the space that's opened up has been a space that I've looked for in terms of my own particular way of having a conversation about art, modern art and theology. It probably hasn't been a conventional way to think about art, but there's tremendous space there. You just have to look for it and be sensitive to it.
And it seems like some of these very same ideas that you're working through can be applied to so many other different disciplines of the arts and culture. That sort of modernist mindset that can often be resisted.
Yeah, I mean, I think as much as we want to deny it, perhaps, modernity is something that we've inherited, and our understanding of the world is shaped by modernity. And the history and tradition of modern art is one of those cultural practices that connects with how we experience the world. And something happens in the artist studio in which the artist is confronted with a very basic question, and that is, how do I understand the work that I do has any value? In the studio, but outside in the world. And how do I understand that how do I understand the work that I do as being significant and meaningful? And that is bless you. And that is a powerful theological space, because you can't help but have a theological conversation, whether you recognize it as one or not.
Questions. Question was, sorry, I'm repeating this for the cameras. Fear of modern art, would that be equated with the fear of God?
Fear in the sense that I'm the one that's being acted on, I suppose. That God often remains hidden to me. And I understand God working in the world through reminding myself of the promises that He has given us. And so the fact that God is not controllable, that He's operating, He's the actor, and I'm the one that's receiving the action, makes God unpredictable, which requires that I have to respond to Him in faith. The fear I have for modern art is the risk of allowing it to do something to me and to embrace it as not just a tool that I use to score theological points or a tool to make a living, but that it is actually changing me and touching me and connecting with me in ways that I can't predict. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. Okay, the question is, have I become... The question is, why haven't I become an artist, or have I thought about doing art? I approach the work that I do as a scholar, as a critic, as a curator, as my studio work. And so just as an artist goes into the studio and understands the work that she does as helping her to understand something about herself and the world, that's what I do with my work. And so the sentences that I write, the way that I think about modern art is all bound up with my attempt to learn something about myself, about the world. And so it operates as a studio practice, and I want it to come off that way. So, yeah, it's a good question. The question is, what would I say to persons who don't think about their participation in art or engagement with art as one in which the art or cultural artifacts actually exert pressure or have agency on us? And my response is to think about, is for students, for example, just to think about the effect that music has on them, to think about the effect of a smell and how that smell takes you someplace. That reading a poem moves you in an emotional way that you're not really in control of. And to just bring people in contact with how they're experiencing the world. And part of it's trying harder. Working in a museum for as long as I did, I noticed people coming into the museum, and people would come into the museum and they're going to educate, they're going to learn something, and they're going to get a lecture, and they're going to come out with information. And so they're working very hard to be in control of it. And where I noticed with kids would come in and they were kind of like, they were in many ways more open to receive what was taking place. So at a certain point in adulthood, you're going there to learn something, and by gum, you're going to learn something. If it means you're not, you're going to stay in control of learning something, you're going to get some content, you're going to take some content. And so what I did in my talks and my tours, et cetera, was to allow people, or to allow the work of art to connect with who they are, where they're at. So no artist makes a work of art for an art historian or a curator or a critic. When they're making a work, they're thinking about a human being who suffers, loves, feels, and you all fit that. And that's what I, as a curator, want, and a critic, want people to get in touch with. Not the school side of their learning, or that they're getting information, but the feeling aspect of the humanity. So oftentimes we look at art in ways to say, well, we have to become art historians, or we need to change our way of thinking, or we need to leave those feelings and thoughts and worries at the door of the museum before we go in. But my view is those are exactly what you have to bring there. And a painter who's making a work under stress and strife, working through, trying to figure out who they are and how they operate and interact in the world, is intended to connect with this person that's dealing with those same issues and dealing with those same human connections. And my goal is to find that connection some way or somehow. That's a great observation. Though the observation is there's a tendency on our parts to see modern art because it looks different. It's not behaving the way we think art should. Maybe Bob Ross or Thomas Kincaid, or how we imagine a Renaissance painting to look like Mona Lisa, something recognizable, something we can identify and say, oh, that artist has talent, because that's something I can't do. And you look at paintings and say, really? I could do that. And so we think there's something that we don't have access to. And I would say that, and so there's a certain aspect of modern art in which it is egalitarian in the sense that it's connecting with something that we identify with, and that is we're alone. And that aloneness in the modern tradition becomes the subject in the studio. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael deal with their aloneness in other ways, not in the studio. They don't deal with it in the studio. They are making commissions, they're doing commissions, they're doing the work that they do as artists to satisfy the desires of those that are writing the contracts and telling them they need to have this done for this purpose. Their creativity and freedom comes within those parameters, but sorting through who they are and where they are in the world is not one of the parameters in that space. For the modern artist, it is. And so it's a unique space in that the artist is free to do anything, but they have to do something. They have to figure out what to do. And that, to get to that, now it begins to connect, I think, with, it can connect with you and to me. When we feel like art should look like this over here, we see art that looks like something perhaps that we could do. We realize that the art in it is not the technical capacity, but something else. Something else is happening there. But it's an egalitarianism, though, that requires work. It requires, any kind of practice requires practice. It requires a knowledge in some ways of the tradition, knowing how artists are responding to other artists. Anything worthwhile in culture takes work, from cooking to anything. We have to practice it. And so any practice that we don't know much about looks foreign and odd and strange and has odd rules and odd kinds of affectations. And so art is no different. But part of it is allowing, in the strategies that I've had to use in museum tours, is to not to add more knowledge, more theory, more history onto what the artist or what the person brings to the work, but to actually strip that away and allow the person to actually allow that work to do something to them, and for that person to be sensitive to what it's doing. What is that doing? What are those colors doing? That unfinished canvas, that figure that looks like a child could draw it, what is actually happening to me as I'm allowing it to have an effect? And part of allowing it to have an effect on you is what needs to happen for art to do what it does. And for Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, we've been very nervous about that because we want to be the one making the first strike, and we're sorting, and we're saying, look at this and don't look at that, and we don't allow those artifacts to actually have an effect on us. And it's dangerous and it's risky, but it's also what is rewarding in the human endeavors of these persons that devote their lives to doing something, really, when you get down to it, is silly, right? It's amazing. I remind students all the time that making paintings is silly. Smearing paint on a scrap of canvas, doing it every day, how does that change the world? And so to think about that, and think about those endeavors, to think about that endeavor, puts our endeavors in context also, to think about the work that we do. If it's possible that God actually works through pigments and scraps of canvas and pieces of wood and words on paper, then perhaps he works through the work that we do, whether we think it's not all that significant or not. And often, God is working most powerfully when we think he's left us. We've failed and we've hit rock bottom, or that we are not doing it. And so the history of modern art is the history of artists asking other artists, how am I doing? What do you think? And resisting the pressure of others who want them to quit, paint another way, do something else. And the fortitude and the confidence, in spite of the doubt, to continue to make work is something that we in the church can learn from and draw from. Yeah. Well, I don't think it's easy to just blame the church or to blame the evangelical movement in the church and say, oh, evangelicals don't care about art. But really, larger society doesn't either. We want to instrumentalize it, make it useful, do something. So even taking a Sunday afternoon and going to the museum when you want to learn something, you're instrumentalizing it. You want to learn something. You get a lecture. You want to add a little piece of content. You want to download some content into your brain. And so there's a desire to make it useful. And so you have, recently there's a spate, and it seems to happen every few years. The Wall Street Journal and other news media outlets will do these articles about how getting a liberal arts degree or a studio art degree, an MFA, will help you make more money in the long run, and companies are hiring MFAs because they want creative thinkers. And part of that is trying to find a way to make it useful, to justify it in the world. And so it's a bigger challenge. And one of the theological aspects that I'm interested in is, who are we to say what's useful? Who are we to say how God is working in the world? And if we actually take the scripture seriously, we actually see God working in ways that the religious establishment doesn't notice or doesn't respect. And so within that context, then art operates as this wonderfully useless thing that enriches who we are as feeling human beings and can teach us, to help us connect with what we're doing here and participate in helping us understand the God that acts and works is a God that acts and works through cultural artifacts. Now, in terms of Michelangelo, Raphael, there's no doubt in the context of their studio, they're making discoveries, and that they're given the parameters of how to make work, and their patron tells them you need this and this and this, you need these colors, you need this, you need a certain percentage of it done by your hand and not your studio assistants, setting it all out as a contract. Even within that, Michelangelo and Raphael are discovering things just merely in the process of putting paint on a flat surface. Yet, what changes in the history and tradition of modern art is that those institutions, those questions, those things that are taken for granted, so the space for Michelangelo to innovate, to discover, is a space like this. And it's wonderfully, incredibly deep. But in modern art, the space is massive because the artist is not responding in the same way to the questions, to the conversation that has taken place before. So without a patron, Raphael and Michelangelo do something else with their skills. They make a living doing something else. For the artist working under the conditions of modernism, they don't have that something else. And they don't even have that institutional structure. They've been kicked out of the academy. Their work has been denied acceptance in the academy. And they have to make a decision to do something else with their lives or to continue to paint in a way that's different. And that's what is remarkable about the development of modern art. So I think the conversations are different in terms of scope, in terms of how Michelangelo or Raphael brings their humanity and their creativity to bear when they're putting paint on a surface. But those existential anxieties, often those are getting worked out elsewhere. But in the history and tradition of modern art, they get worked out there, in the studio. Which is why, in the history of modern art, you have people considering modern art to be a religion. And we think, ooh, gosh, that's a bad thing. Well, there's a sense, there's an understanding that something serious is happening. There's a theological conversation taking place. So when colleagues of mine say unabashedly that art is my religion, that's what they mean. By paying attention to art, writing about it, painting, curating exhibitions, they are trying to develop this relationship between themselves and the world, themselves and themselves, and themselves and God, however they understand God. And it's often those colleagues of mine who are not Christians who seem to be more open to see that as a theological thing, that something's happened, there's a stake in it. And that to me is very interesting. And that to me is that space that opens up to think about how theology, Christian theology, can participate in that conversation.
What a great way to wrap things up. Come back to the first question, right? I know some of you have some more questions, and we'll be hanging out for a little bit afterwards, so if you want to come up and ask questions. A couple of quick announcements. Students, if you're around on campus tomorrow, you've probably heard this already, but tomorrow at noon, Dr. Siedell is going to be speaking about Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant, one of his fables that he wrote that's not quite as well known, but should be. So that's going to be tomorrow in here at noon with pizza. And then, well, it's lunchtime, right? And then on Friday, some of you also know about this, Dr. Siedell is leading a tour at the New York Historical Society of their exhibition, The Armory Show at 100, which is a very important moment in modern art history in the United States in 1913. And there's something of an anniversary exhibit at the New York Historical Society with 100 of the something like 1,400 pieces that were in the original. 100 of them are actually there. So he's going to do that on Friday. The tour is at 4, and there's still a little bit of space left. So if you are interested, email me, and I can get you on that list. There's only room for about 30 people for this, but it is free, and it'll be a great opportunity to spend some time with Dr. Siedell and see this extraordinary exhibit. Very excited that we could have this tonight. This is a great opportunity for us to grow as an institution, and to see sort of where the things that we need to be thinking about and working through both as a college, as students, as individuals. So if you all, let's join together and thank Dr. Siedell for his time tonight. Thank you. Good night.